In the winter of 1926, an old woman of 81 signed away the largest private house ever built in New York, a palace of more than 100 rooms on Fifth Avenue, and stood by while men with ropes and hammers began to take it down for a department store. Her name was Alice Vanderbilt, and the house had been her home for almost half a century. She was not the only one. There was the merchant king's widow, who had to buy her husband's stolen body back from grave robbers before she lost their marble palace. There was the Queen of American society, who spent her last evenings greeting the long dead in an empty ballroom that would become a synagogue. There was the castle by the sea, pulled down for the price of a good car. They built in marble and limestone to last 1,000 years. Why did almost none of the houses outlive the families who raised them? Before we go any further, if you love the Gilded Age the way I do, its glamour and its ghosts both, subscribe and stay with me. Over the next hour and a half, I am going to walk you past 5 vanished palaces and stop at the window of the family that watched each one come down. Chapter 1. A promise carved in stone. They chose marble and limestone on purpose, because stone was a promise, and the promise was that the family would last as long as the walls. That is the thing to understand before we stand in front of the first of these houses, because it explains both the ambition and the heartbreak. When a New York family of the 1870s or 1880s or 1890s decided to build, it did not reach for the brownstone that had faced the city for 2 generations. Brownstone read as merely rich. It reached instead for pale, imported stone, for marble quarried at Tuckahoe, for grey limestone shipped from Indiana, for the same materials the kings of France had used 500 years before. The stone was an argument. It said that this family was not a lucky accident of the railroad age or the retail counter, that it was permanent, that it belonged, that it would be here when the grandchildren of the grandchildren were old. There was a reason the argument had to be made in stone, and the reason is that in America there was nothing else to make it in. There was no aristocracy to be born into, no titles to inherit, no ancient acres that came with a name. A man could hold one of the largest fortunes on earth and still find the door of a Fifth Avenue drawing room closed against him because the woman on the other side of it had decided his money was too new. So the money spoke the only way it could. It built. It raised châteaux modelled on the Loire and Renaissance palaces copied from Blois, and it filled them with painted ceilings and marble stairs and galleries of old masters. And it said, in the only language the city could not ignore, "We are here to stay." And here is the cruelty at the heart of every story in this film. The city these families were speaking to had no intention of letting anything stay. New York was, and is, a machine for turning ground into money, and the ground under a Fifth Avenue palace was the most valuable ground in the country. As the shops and the towers marched north up the avenue, that ground began to be worth more empty than full. A house that had cost $2 or $3 million to build and untold sums to fill became worth less than the dirt it stood on. The land wanted the house gone. And so, one by one, within a single human lifetime, the palaces that had been raised to outlast the centuries were pulled down for the value of their lots, and the men and women who had built them, if they lived long enough, stood across the street and watched. This is the story of 5 of those families, and we will take them in the order in which the wrecking crews came, which is also, as it happens, an order of deepening sorrow. It begins with the first great palace on the avenue, and with a widow who had already learned, in the most terrible way, that even the dead are not permitted to rest in this city. Chapter 2. The Merchant Prince Who Built in Marble. Before there was a millionaire's row, there was one white house at the corner of 34th Street that stopped traffic. It stood at the northwest corner of 5th Avenue and 34th, and when it was finished, around 1869, there was nothing else like it in America. Every other grand house in the city was faced in the sober chocolate of brownstone. This one was clad in gleaming white Tuckahoe marble, cool and pale and foreign, and it had cost its owner something on the order of $2 million at a time when that sum could have built a small town. People came simply to stand on the pavement and look at it. That was the point. The man who built it was named Alexander Turney Stewart, and his life was the American dream told at its most extreme. He had come from Ulster, in the north of Ireland, a poor young immigrant arriving in New York in the early years of the century with almost nothing. What he had instead was a cold and brilliant instinct for selling. He opened a small dry goods shop, and then a larger one. And he did something that seems obvious now, and was revolutionary then. He put a fixed price on every item, and he refused to haggle. He filled his windows with plate glass, and his floors with more goods than any store had ever held. His great marble store downtown on Broadway was itself nicknamed the Marble Palace, and his later cast-iron emporium was for a time the largest retail store in the world. He more or less invented the department store, and it made him one of the 2 or 3 richest men in the United States. When he died, his fortune was reckoned as high as $50 million, a sum that in the money of today runs into the many hundreds of millions, perhaps beyond. He built his marble house at the top of that fortune, and he built it with the same architect, John Kellam, who had raised his stores. Kellam gave him a palace in the French Second Empire style then arriving from Paris, and clad the whole of it in that startling white marble. And inside he hung a picture gallery of old masters and modern canvases that was among the finest private collections in the city. It was, in every sense, a statement of arrival, the first of the Fifth Avenue palaces, the house that taught the Vanderbilts and the Astors what the avenue could be. At his side, through all of it, was his wife, Cornelia Mitchell Clinch Stewart. They had married in 1823, early and long before the fortune, and they would be married for more than half a century. They had no surviving children, and that single fact, quiet as it sounds, is the hinge on which the whole tragedy turns. For a fortune of tens of millions and a marble palace, there was no son to inherit, no daughter to carry it forward, only Cornelia, and the men her husband trusted to manage what he left. Stewart had built a house to last 1,000 years and a name to go with it, and he had no one of his own blood to hand either one to. He died in the April of 1876, and the marble palace passed into the keeping of his widow and the hands of his executor. But the strangest and most frightening chapter of the Stewart story did not begin in the house at all. It began 2 years later, in the dark, in a churchyard, when someone decided that even the body of the merchant prince was worth more taken than left in peace. Chapter 3. They stole the body before they took the house. On a November night in 1878, grave robbers broke into the merchant prince's tomb and carried his body away into the dark. Stewart had been buried in the churchyard of St. Mark's in the Bowery, in a family vault. The burial chamber sunk some 12 feet into the ground. On the night of the 7th of November, men came with tools and patience, lifted the marble slabs, broke into the vault, and took the corpse. The theft was not discovered until the next day, when the displaced stone was noticed above an otherwise undisturbed grave. The body of one of the richest men in America was simply gone. What followed reads like something out of the penny dreadfuls the age devoured, except that it was real, and it happened to a grieving widow. Ransom demands arrived. The thieves, through intermediaries, wanted money for the return of the bones, and the figures named ran as high as $250,000, addressed to the estate and to the judge, Henry Hilton, who managed it. There were negotiations, refusals, more demands. A large sum was refused, and in the end, around 1881, 3 years after the theft, Cornelia Stewart paid. By the accounts that survive, she handed over something on the order of $20,000 in the dark on a country road up in Westchester County, and received in exchange a burlap sack of bones. Whether they were her husband's bones, no one could ever say for certain. Not everyone was convinced that the merchant prince had truly come home. Think of that, at the end of a 50-year marriage. A widow buying back a sack of remains on a dark road, unable to know if the man inside the sack was the man she had married. The plain explanation is the simple, sordid one, that a rich and famous corpse was an obvious target for extortion in a city with little grave security and a long tradition of body snatching, and that the whole horror was a business transaction, cruel and nothing more. And yet the doubt has never quite been laid to rest, because the bones were never truly proven, and so the merchant prince, in the telling that has come down to us, is a man twice lost, once to death, and once to the dark. Where the record turns strange like this, we will turn with it, and then leave the verdict where the historians leave it, which is open. The house outlived him, but not by much, and it did not outlive the fortune. Cornelia was childless and elderly, and the empire her husband had built was left in the hands of his executor, Judge Hilton, who proved catastrophically unequal to it. The great stores declined and were let go, the Stewart name in retail faded, and the vast fortune began to dissolve. Cornelia leased the Marble Palace to a gentleman's club, the Manhattan Club, so that it never again lived as a family home. She herself died in 1886, and in 1901 the Marble Palace at 34th Street, the house that had stopped traffic, the first of the avenue's white palaces, was pulled down, unceremoniously, for commercial building. It had stood for barely 30 years. There was no child to grieve it, only the ghost of a name and the empty place where the marble had been. Stewart had believed, more than any of them, that stone and money together could purchase permanence. He had built 2 marble palaces and endowed a whole planned town on Long Island, and he had reached beyond the grave for a name that would last. And the city took the house, and the executor took the fortune, and grave robbers took even the body. The next families would build larger and grander than Stewart ever dreamed. But they would not even be granted the mercy of dying first. They would live to watch the greatest houses of all come down. Chapter 4. The House That Started the War. When Alva Vanderbilt could not get into society, she built her way in, with a limestone château and a party that cost $250,000. She was born Alva Erskine Smith in Alabama, and she had the ferocious will of someone who has been on the wrong side of a closed door. She had married William Kissam Vanderbilt, a grandson of the old Commodore, which made her rich beyond counting and, in the eyes of the old families, still nobody at all. The Vanderbilt money was railroad money, and it was new, and the woman who ruled society, Caroline Astor, would not receive it. So Alva did what the powerless with money have always done in this story. She built. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the most fashionable architect of the age, to raise her a French Renaissance chateau at 665th Avenue, at the corner of 52nd Street, modelled on the Château de Blois in the Loire Valley. It went up between about 1878 and 1882, and it was built, pointedly, of pale grey Indiana limestone rather than brownstone, because limestone read as European and permanent, where brownstone read as merely rich. The city called it the Petit Château. Inside there was a grand hall running some 60 feet, a banquet hall rising 2 full stories, interiors of Caen stone and walnut, ceilings painted by a French master, and more than 40 carvers set to work on the stone. Alva even had a portrait of Hunt himself carved into the facade, a tribute in stone to the man who built her weapon. For a weapon is what it was. In 1883, Alva threw a costume ball to open the house, and it was one of the most extravagant private entertainments the country had ever seen, costing an estimated $250,000, with tens of thousands spent on champagne alone and thousands more on flowers, at a time when a servant in that house might earn a few $100s in a year. And Alva made it known that a certain young Miss Astor, Caroline's daughter, could not be invited because the families had never formally met. The message was exact. If Mrs. Astor wanted her daughter at the ball everyone in New York was talking about, she would have to call on the Vanderbilts first and so acknowledge them. And Mrs. Astor, checkmated, called. The war for the avenue was over almost before it began, and Alva had won it with a house. She would go further still. She weaponized her own daughter, the beautiful Consuelo, forcing her into a loveless marriage with the Duke of Marlborough to buy the family a coronet. And then, in 1895, she did the truly unthinkable and divorced William Kissam Vanderbilt in a scandal that shook society to its foundations. She remarried, was widowed again, and reinvented herself entirely, which is a story we will return to at the end, because the woman who opened the building war is also the woman who will close this film. But the Petit Château, the house that started everything, met the common fate, first of all, the Vanderbilt palaces. By the middle of the 1920s, the avenue had turned commercial, and the limestone château was worth far less than the ground beneath it. It was sold to a developer for a reported $4 million, and in 1926, the demolition began. A 20-story commercial building rose in its place and opened the following year. The house had stood barely 40 years. Hunt's carved portrait, the grand hall, the ballroom where Mrs. Astor had been forced to surrender, all of it went down into dust and rubble. And Alva, long divorced and living much of her life abroad, outlived the monument that had made her name. The woman she had forced to her knees would fall further and stranger than a wrecking ball ever reaches. Chapter 5. The Queen and Her 1,000-Guest Ballroom. Caroline Astor built a ballroom that could hold 1,200 people, and for a while she decided who in America was allowed inside it. She was Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor, of an old Knickerbocker family, married into the vast Astor fortune, and for a generation she was, by common consent, the queen of American society. There was no throne and no crown, only her drawing room and her ballroom and the invitations that went out from them. But within that world, her power was absolute. Her social lieutenant, Ward McAllister, gave the Age one of its most famous phrases when he declared that there were only about 400 people in New York who really mattered, the number, so the story went, that could fit comfortably into Mrs. Astor's ballroom. To be inside the 400 was to exist. To be outside, it was to be nobody, however much money you had, as the Vanderbilts had learned. The house from which she ruled, in the last and grandest phase of her reign, was a double mansion at 840 and 841 Fifth Avenue at 65th Street. It was designed, like so many of these palaces, by Richard Morris Hunt, and built between about 1893 and 1896, again in the early French Renaissance manner of Blois. It was in truth 2 houses joined into one, Caroline taking the northern half and her son, John Jacob Astor IV, the southern. And its heart was a ballroom said to hold as many as 1,200 people, spanning the entire rear of the house, rising several stories, doubling as an art gallery hung with paintings. It was the largest and most famous private room in the city, the literal throne room of American society. and on the nights of her great balls, it blazed with light and filled with everyone who mattered, all of them there at her pleasure. But even as the house was being finished, the world it was built to command was already coming apart. McAllister had published a version of the 400 list, and the moment it was in the newspapers, the mystery that gave it power began to leak away. New fortunes were rising faster than any drawing room could judge them. The old rules that had let one woman rule an entire society were dissolving in the very decade the great ballroom opened. Caroline Astor had built herself a palace for a kingdom that was quietly ceasing to exist. And she was growing old. The Queen of the 400, who had spent her life deciding the fate of families with the tilt of her head, was moving toward the strangest and most haunting final act of any figure in this film. For the woman who had filled that ballroom with the living would end by filling it, night after night, with the dead. Chapter 6. She kept greeting guests who were dead. In her last years, Caroline Astor would dress for a ball, descend to her empty ballroom, and greet by name the guests who had been dead for years. Her mind, in old age, began to loosen from the present and drift back into the world she had ruled. By the accounts of those who chronicled her final years, she would receive her butler in the mornings and discuss with him the guest lists and the arrangements for great balls that would never be held. And in the evenings, after her customary carriage ride through the park, she would come down the grand stair into the vast and empty ballroom, and there she would move among her guests, nodding, smiling, exchanging pleasantries with the most distinguished figures of a society that was mostly in its graves. She greeted the long dead as though the season were at its height and the room were full. At one point, it is said, she became convinced that she was young again and expecting a child, and had a nursery prepared. It is one of the eeriest images the Gilded Age has left us, an old woman in her jewels curtsying to an empty floor, and it would be easy to reach for the language of hauntings. The grounded explanation is gentler and sadder. This was almost certainly the progress of dementia, a mind retreating from a present it no longer recognized into the one moment when it had been most fully itself, when the ballroom was full and the Queen was on her throne. Whether in those hours she truly saw the faces of the dead gathered around her, no one living can say, and we will leave that where it belongs, which is unanswered. But whatever she saw, the room she stood in was empty, and the society she was greeting was gone, and she was, in the most literal way, the last guest at her own party. She died on the 30th of October, 1908. And the Astor story did not soften after her. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, who had shared the double mansion, met one of the most famous deaths of the century when he went down with the Titanic in the April of 1912, drowned in the North Atlantic while his young, pregnant wife was put into a lifeboat. The house that had held the Queen and her heir had now lost both, and the house itself followed them. With Caroline dead and the old society scattered, the double mansion was sold, passed into the hands of a developer, and around 1926 it was pulled down. On the corner where the Queen of the 400 had reigned, where the greatest ballroom in America had blazed, there rose the great synagogue of Temple Emmanuel, dedicated in 1930, its congregation worshipping in the space where Mrs. Astor had once decided who in America was allowed to exist. There is no gentler emblem of an entire world passing than that. A house of exclusion become a house of prayer. The next house we come to was larger than the Astor Palace, larger than any of them, the biggest private house the city has ever built, and its mistress would give it up with a single, plain, unforgettable word. Chapter 7. The largest house New York ever built. At the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street stood a house of more than 100 rooms, the largest private residence the city has ever seen. It filled the entire block front of Fifth Avenue from 57th Street to 58th, a vast pile of red brick and pale limestone, turreted and gabled like a French château grown to the scale of a public building. It began in 1883, the work of the architect George Post, and over the following decade it was enlarged and enriched, with Richard Morris Hunt lending his hand to the expansion, until it swallowed the whole block and became simply the biggest thing of its kind in America. Where Alva's Petit Château had been a jewel, this was a mountain. It belonged to Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the eldest grandson of the Commodore and the head of the family in his generation, a serious, pious, hard-working man who ran the great New York Central Railroad and carried the weight of the Vanderbilt name. And it belonged, above all, to his wife, Alice Claypool Gwynn Vanderbilt, a woman of iron propriety who would come to be known from their Newport cottage as Alice of the Breakers. Together, they built not one palace but two, the mountain on Fifth Avenue and the great marble cottage called the Breakers at Newport. And they filled both with the machinery of a life lived on the largest possible scale. Cornelius II died in 1899, felled by a stroke, still in his middle 50s, leaving Alice a widow with an enormous fortune held in trust and two of the largest houses in the country to maintain. And maintain them she did, for more than a quarter of a century. Where other families sold and scattered, Alice held on. She kept the mountain on Fifth Avenue and the cottage at Newport running in the old style, with their armies of servants and their acres of rooms, long after the world that had produced them had begun to vanish. She was the keeper of the flame, the widow who would not let go, presiding in her black and her pearls over the grandest private house in America as the 20th century rose around it and the avenue filled with shops. But she was also a woman who had known more than her share of grief, and the losses had compounded down the years. One son had died young, in the 1890s. Her eldest son had been all but cast out of the family for marrying against its wishes, a wound that never fully healed. And in 1915, another son, Alfred, went down with the Lusitania, drowned by a German torpedo, last seen giving up his own lifebelt. Alice held the largest house in New York, and she had buried or lost more of her children than any house could console her for. She owned everything, and she could keep almost none of what mattered. And at last, an old woman past 80, she looked at the mountain she had defended for 27 years, and she made a decision that would have been unthinkable to the man who built it. Chapter 8. A Burden of 100 Rooms. In 1926, at 81, Alice Vanderbilt told the world that the largest house in New York had become a burden, and let it go. The word is the important thing, and it is her own, reported in the newspapers of the day. Not a treasure, not a monument, not a sacred trust, a burden. The greatest private house ever raised in the city, the mountain of red brick and limestone that had taken a decade to build and stood as the very summit of Vanderbilt ambition, had become, to the woman who had guarded it longest, simply too much to carry. The arithmetic behind that single word is the arithmetic of this whole film, and it is brutal. By the middle of the 1920s, the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street was among the most valuable commercial ground on earth. The house, however magnificent, was worth far less standing than the land would be worth cleared. Alice sold the site for a reported $7 million, and the buyers wanted the mountain gone. In 1926 and into 27, the largest private house in America was demolished. Its 100 rooms broken open to the sky, its marble and its paneling and its fireplaces stripped and crated and carried away, its stone carted off as rubble. And on the cleared ground, there rose the elegant limestone building of the Bergdorf Goodman department store. which opened in 1928 and stands there to this day. Consider what that means, because it is the cruelest of all the erasures in this story. The Astor Palace became a synagogue, a house of God. Stewart's marble palace became an office building, but the largest private house in the history of New York, the ultimate expression of what a family fortune could raise, was pulled down so that strangers could buy gloves and gowns where the Vanderbilts had climbed the grandest stair in the city. Not a rival dynasty took the ground, not even a church. A shop did. Today, tens of thousands of people a year walk across the floor of Bergdorf Goodman, most of them with no idea that they are walking through the ghost of the greatest house America ever built. Alice took a portion of the $7 million and bought herself a comparatively modest existing mansion for around $800,000 and lived out her last years there, the keeper of the flame, at last, without the house to keep. She died in 1934. She had outlived her husband by 35 years, outlived several of her children, and outlived the mountain itself. And she had said the truest thing anyone in this film ever said about these palaces, which is that in the end, they were a burden, worth more dead than alive. But one woman had watched all of this, the whole long fall of the avenue, and she was not done building. She had one more house in her, a castle by the sea, and it would vanish more completely than any palace on Fifth Avenue. Chapter 9. The Suffragist Who Built a Castle. The same woman who began the war on Fifth Avenue built one last house, a white castle on the Long Island shore, and this time she built it for herself. We left Alva Vanderbilt in the 1890s, divorced, scandalous, victorious, the woman who had conquered society with the petit château and then walked away from her Vanderbilt marriage. Her second act was longer and stranger, and, in its way, grander than her first. She married again to Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, and was widowed a second time. And then, in her later years, this creature of ballrooms and coronets and social warfare became something no one could have predicted. She became a militant, a leader of the American movement for women's suffrage, pouring her Vanderbilt and Belmont money into the fight for the vote, opening her houses to the cause, marching under its banners, a general once more, but now in a very different war. And around 1917 and 18, at the height of that second life, she built Beacon Towers. It rose at Sands Point, on the north shore of Long Island, looking out over the water, and it was designed by Richard Howland Hunt, a son of the Richard Morris Hunt who had built the Petit Château, so that the same architectural bloodline that opened this story also drew its final house. But Beacon Towers was nothing like the French chateau of the Avenue. It was a white castle, tall and Gothic and romantic, all towers and battlements, closer to a fairy tale of medieval Ireland than to anything on Fifth Avenue, a fortress of the imagination set down on the American shore. By tradition, its very name and its beacon towers carried an association with the cause she now served, a light held up, and Alva used the castle in service of the movement. There was something fitting and something moving in it. The woman who had built her first house as a weapon to force her way into a world of closed doors had built her last house for herself, and lent it to the fight to open a far greater door for millions of women who would never see the inside of a ballroom. She had spent the first half of her life demanding to be let in, and the second half tearing down the walls. Beacon Towers was the monument of that second life, the castle of the general in her final campaign. She would not see it fall, and perhaps that was a mercy. Alva died in 1933, and at her funeral, the honor guard was made up entirely of women, a last banner raised for the cause. But her white castle by the sea, like every other house in this story, was living on borrowed time, And its ending would be the most complete vanishing of them all, a castle pulled down for the price of a car and then made immortal, of all things, by a novel. Chapter 10. A castle sold for the price of a car. Beacon Towers passed to William Randolph Hearst, who renamed it for a saint, and then, in 1945, it was pulled down for about $10,000. Hearst, the newspaper king, bought the castle in 1927, in the years when he and his companion were assembling their own world of collected grandeur. He set about changing it to his taste, raising the roof, adding dormers, enlarging the long, narrow windows to let in more light and air, and he gave it a new name. He called it St. Joan, for Joan of Arc, and for his wife Millicent, so that Alva's suffragist castle became a Hearst possession with a saint's name. He held it for over a decade, and then in 1940 he sold it on. And in 1945 the end came, and it came cheaply. The castle that Alva had raised at the height of her fortune, that Hearst had bought and remade, was demolished for a cost reported at about $10,000. $10,000 to erase a castle. 8 houses were built on its grounds, of which 6 survive today on a road named for the old Sands Point Light. The great white fortress on the shore, the last house of the woman who started the building war, was simply scraped away to make room for a handful of suburban homes. It was the most total erasure in this entire film. The Fifth Avenue palaces at least left their sites to a synagogue, a store, an office tower, grand new uses for grand old ground. Beacon Towers left almost nothing at all. What remains to this day is a gatehouse, now a private home, and scattered among the trees a few old towers, a ruined garden wall, some stones lying in the woods where a castle used to be. And yet Beacon Towers may be the most immortal of all these houses, and by the strangest route. For it stands on the north shore of Long Island, at Sands Point, in the exact landscape where a young writer named Scott Fitzgerald set the greatest American novel of the age. It is widely believed to be one of the inspirations for the mansion of J. Gatsby, the great glittering pile across the water, the house of a man who built a fortune and a palace to win his way into a world that would never truly let him in. If that is so, then the wheel turns all the way around, because that was Alva's own story, told at the beginning of this film. The outsider who built to force her way in. Alva raised her castle for herself and her cause, and the sea took the cause's memory of it, and the wreckers took the castle. And what survived was a ghost of it inside a novel about a man who built a palace to win a world that pulled its houses down. 5 families now, and 5 palaces, and almost nothing left to stand inside. Chapter 11. The dirt was worth more than the dream. None of these houses fell to fire or war or ruin. They fell to arithmetic, to a city where the ground was worth more than anything you could build on it. That is the mechanism beneath every story we have told, and it is worth seeing plainly because it is what makes this history so different from the fall of a European great house. In England or in France, a family might lose its palace to debt, to war, to the slow bleed of taxes across centuries, but the house itself would more often than not survive, because the land it stood on was quiet land, worth roughly what it had always been worth. In New York, the land would not hold still. Every year the commercial city marched further north, and every year the ground under these palaces climbed in value, until the house sitting on it was a kind of financial mistake, a low use of priceless dirt. 2 other forces pressed in the same direction. The first was tax. The income tax arrived to stay in 1913, and estate taxes came behind it, and together they began, slowly, to erode the vast, untaxed fortunes that had made such houses thinkable in the first place. The second was labor. A palace of 100 rooms was not a house so much as a small industry, and it ran on people, on the dozens of servants who cooked and cleaned and carried and kept the illusion of effortless grandeur alive. Across the city, servants made up something like 1 in 6 of the entire population. Overwhelmingly immigrants, Irish and German and Scandinavian, an unseen workforce living in the cramped top floors and the basements beneath the marble. As the century turned and that workforce found other work in a changing economy, the human machinery that made these houses possible began to disappear, and a palace you could not staff was a palace you could not keep. So the great houses were caught in a vice. The ground beneath them screamed to be sold. The taxes nibbled at the fortunes that fed them. The servants who ran them melted away. And one by one the families did the only rational thing, which was to let go, to take the 7 million for the land, to sign the papers, to stand at the window while the ropes went up and the stone came down. It was not villainy that erased these houses. It was the same cold market logic that had raised them, the same machine running in reverse. The money had built them because building was the only way to speak, and the money unbuilt them because the ground could finally speak louder than the stone. Chapter 12. What the Wreckers Left Standing. Almost the only places you can still walk into this vanished world are not in the city at all, but on a cliff in Newport. Fifth Avenue, the great battlefield of these families, kept almost nothing. Where the Petit Château stood there is an office building. Where the Astor double mansion stood there is a synagogue. Where the largest house in America stood there is a department store. Where Stewart's marble palace stood, the ground was long ago given over to commerce. The corridor of limestone and marble that 2 generations bankrupted their imaginations to build is, along its most famous stretch, simply gone, replaced by the ordinary busy city that grew up over its grave. What survives mostly by accident or by escape. In Newport, Rhode Island, on the cliffs above the Atlantic, the summer cottages of these same families were saved, most of them, as museums, because a small city built on old money found in the 20th century that it could sell tickets to the past. The Breakers. The Newport Palace of Cornelius and Alice Vanderbilt still stands, the most visited house museum in the state, and a visitor walking its halls is walking the closest surviving thing to the vanished mountain on Fifth Avenue. Marble House, the palace that William and Alva Vanderbilt built at Newport, still stands as well, so that the ghost of the Petit Château, in a sense, has a body after all. Downtown in Manhattan, Stewart's original marble store building survives and is protected, a fragment of the merchant prince's white world. At Sands Point, the gatehouse of Beacon Towers survives, and its stones lie in the woods. And on the Astor corner, Temple Emmanuel stands and worships, a survivor of a wholly different kind. The rest is fragments, paneling and fireplaces sold off and scattered into other houses and museums, portraits and furniture dispersed to collections, photographs, thousands of them, of interiors no living eye will ever see again. These are the relics of the age, and they are precious precisely because there are so few of them, because the great houses that produced them were nearly all pulled down. The survivors are not the rule. They are the lucky exceptions, and their rarity is the exact measure of how much was lost. Chapter 13. The absence is the story. The grandest houses America ever built are, for the most part, simply not there, and that absence is the truest thing they left behind. It is a strange thing to build a documentary around an emptiness, around office towers and shop floors, and a stretch of ordinary avenue. But that emptiness is the whole point, because it is the answer to the question the hook asked. These families built in marble and limestone and castle granite precisely to last 1,000 years. They chose the most permanent materials on earth, copied the palaces of kings, carved their tributes into the stone, and they did all of it as a bet that money could buy time, that a great enough fortune spent on great enough stone could purchase a place in the future for a family and a name. And the bet failed. Faster and more completely here than almost anywhere in the world. Not one of these houses reached its 50th birthday still lived in as a home. The stone that was supposed to mean forever turned out to mean 40 years, because the city that raised these families cared nothing for permanence and everything for the next and higher use of the ground. The very engine that made the fortunes, the ruthless upward pressure of American money, was the engine that erased their monuments. What the market built, the market took back, and it took it back within a single human lifetime, so that the same eyes that had watched the scaffolding go up watched the wrecking crews arrive. Stand for a moment at that window, in whichever house you choose. You have poured a fortune into stone. You have filled the rooms with everything beautiful the world can sell. You have believed, because everyone around you believed, that this would outlast you and your children and your children's children. And now you are old, and the men are on the roof with their ropes, and the marble is coming down into the street, and you understand at last that you never owned a piece of the future at all. You owned a very expensive present for a little while, on ground that always belonged to the city. That is the revelation these vanished palaces leave us, written not in what stands, but in what is gone. The absence is the monument. The empty avenue is the truest portrait of the age. Chapter 14. The Woman at the Window. Return to the winter of 1926, to the old woman watching the largest house in New York come down around her memory of it. Alice Vanderbilt, 81 years old, keeper of the flame for 27 years, standing at last on the far side of the decision she never thought she would make. And gather, around her, the others, because they were all, in their way, standing at that same window. Cornelia Stewart, who had first to buy her husband's stolen bones on a dark country road, and then to watch the first marble palace on the avenue leased away and pulled down. Alva Vanderbilt, who conquered a society with a house and outlived that house, and built a castle for a nobler war and outlived that too. Caroline Astor, who greeted the dead in a ballroom that would become a place of prayer, and Alice herself, giving up the mountain for a shop. They watched their marble palaces reduced to rubble. They watched the ballrooms where they had reigned, filled with wrecking dust. They watched the largest houses in the country valued for the dirt beneath them and pulled down for the value of the ground. They watched the stone they had chosen to mean forever mean, in the end, almost nothing at all. Each of them had believed the promise, and each of them lived long enough to see it broken. And that is the thing these 5 families share across the decades that separate them. More than the fortunes, more than the architects, more than the French château and the Newport cottages. They shared the window. They shared the view of their own permanence coming down. Alice gave us the plainest word for it, and it will do for all of them. The house, she said, had become a burden. The greatest private house ever built in America, and its own mistress called it a burden and let it go, because that is what these palaces finally were. Not fortresses of a family's future, but weights too heavy for any fortune to carry against the pull of the ground. They built in stone to outlast the centuries. They got a single lifetime, and the privilege, if you can call it that, of watching the centuries be taken back. The marble is gone from 34th Street. The Queen's Ballroom is a synagogue. A department store stands where the mountain stood. A castle lies in stones among the trees. And somewhere in all that vanished grandeur is the last lesson of the Gilded Age. that money can buy almost anything: a palace, a name, a place at the head of society. Everything except the one thing they wanted most, which was to last. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the glamour and the ruin, and the ghosts that live in the gap between them, then subscribe and stay with me, because there are more of these stories than you would believe. And before you go, tell me in the comments which of these 5 you would grieve the most: the merchant's marble palace, the Queen's ballroom, the largest house in New York, or the castle by the sea. And tell me honestly, if the house had become your burden too, whether you would have signed the papers and let it fall.